Okay, let's unpack this. We have a powerful stack of sources today that paints a picture of, well, intense interconnected change. We're talking about everything from the high-stakes world of global trade friction and simmering regional bank panics, all the way down to the radical economics of AI power consumption and, critically, how much house you can actually afford next year.
What's really fascinating here is just how quickly market sentiment is shifting. It's quite volatile. I mean, one minute yields are dropping because of anxiety about regional bank stability, and the next we're projecting the energy needs of devices you wear on your face. Our job today is to try and give you the signal and the noise show how policy decisions affect the national debt and how, a seemingly simple tech purchase shifts the infrastructure of global computing.
Right, that's our mission. Distill the key takeaways across finance, technology, and, frankly, political paralysis. We want to ensure you have the targeted knowledge needed to navigate these shifts. So let's start with the immediate financial anxiety on Wall Street. The major headline right now is the 10-year Treasury yield moving substantially lower, dropping below 4%. Now, while that sounds great for future borrowing costs, the motivation for that drop is usually fear, isn't it? What's the underlying anxiety driving this flight to safety?
Yeah, it's not just general nervousness. It seems to be a specific concern about credit. Liz Ann Saunders from Charles Schwab correctly attributes the yield drop to a classic flight to safety. That's true. But Mohamed El-Orian, he drills down further. He says yields are moving lower because investors are genuinely worried about credit quality, particularly within the smaller regional banking sector. They're seeking the safety of government bonds, pushing bond prices up, and consequently yields down.
Okay, so is this just classic market overreaction, or are the failures we're seeing in the private lending sector substantial enough to suggest there's a real, maybe hidden vulnerability?
Well, we're seeing evidence that supports the vulnerability argument. Definitely. This fear is tied to what Jamie Dimon famously called the cockroach effect. You remember that?
Oh yeah, when you see one cockroach?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There were probably more. And that metaphor became immediately relevant following the bankruptcies of two auto industry-related companies, First Brands and Tricolor Holdings. Those failures signaled potential sour loans hiding in, these opaque private credit markets.
And the market immediately started looking for the exposed names, I imagine.
Precisely. The market didn't wait for confirmation. Shares of regional banks like Zions Bank Corporation and Western Alliance Bancorp, they just tumbled dramatically. Zions dropped more than 13% after facing a sizable charge due to unexpected loan losses. When anxiety like this hits, it hits fast. Overall, the SPDR S&P Regional Banking ETF, KRE, lost more than 6% in one session. Pretty much every member of that key fund was in the red. It really shows the acute danger of, opacity in the credit system.
Okay, that's the high finance side. Now, if we connect this volatility to the personal finance reality for consumers, here's where the pressure really seems to mount. We've seen the Fed cut rates, but why are consumer interest rates, specifically credit card APRs, staying so stubbornly high?
That weak correlation is the biggest squeeze on American households right now. It really is. Nearly half of U.S. households carry credit card debt, and the average interest rate is now soaring. It's above 20%. And the friction is stark. When the Federal Reserve cut its benchmark rate by a full percentage point in late 2024, the average credit card rate fell by only a negligible 0.23% over that same period.
Just 0.23%. That feels almost predatory when you look at that disparity.
It really illustrates how credit card lenders prioritize profit and risk assessment over simply matching Fed policy moves. The Q3 2025 average credit card rate was 24.22%. That barely budged, down just 0.09% from the previous quarter. So for consumers carrying a balance, the relief from those big macro rate changes is minuscule, almost non-existent. We've got these volatile regional banks on one side, but the consumers dealing with debt costs that are incredibly sticky and just show no sign of yielding, regardless of what the Fed does.
So, okay, we have consumers dealing with record sticky debt rates, mounting credit anxiety in the banking sector. Let's pull back a bit and look at the global economic friction that adds yet another cost onto that consumer burden, tariffs and trade policy.
Yeah.
Who is really footing the bill for this global tension?
Well, we have a critical figure from S&P Global that puts the size of this tariff burden into perspective. It's quite staggering. They estimate that the current U.S. tariff regime will cost global businesses upwards of, wait for it, $1.2 trillion in 2025 alone.
1.2 trillion. That cost is enormous. And if you combine that with the difficulty consumers are already having managing high interest payments, this becomes a really deep economic squeeze.
How much of that $1.2 trillion is actually hitting the consumer?
A significant portion, unfortunately. S&P Global estimates that two-thirds of this massive cost will be passed directly onto consumers.
Two-thirds.
Yep, through higher prices on goods, with only about one-third absorbed by the companies themselves. So you, the listener, you're paying the price for these geopolitical trade policies right at the register.
And this pain is very real for export-heavy nations that rely on access to, well, to our markets. The situation in Switzerland you mentioned is a perfect example, right?
It is. It's a clear ripple effect. The Swiss government recently had to cut its 2026 GDP growth forecast way down to just 0.9%. They explicitly cite the heavy burden of U.S. tariffs, noting Switzerland faces one of the highest country-specific tariff rates, an astounding 39%.
39%. 39%. Georges Kern, the CEO of luxury watchmaker Breitling, he called that rate terrible news. It shows that even high-margin luxury industries are really feeling the pressure.
And the geopolitical tension is now, it seems, weaponizing critical supply chains, like rare earth minerals.
That's a key area of focus for you, the listener, to watch. China recently accused the U.S. of creating panic over its rare earth export controls, although they do maintain they're open to trade talks. But this market is absolutely non-negotiable for U.S. national security. It's essential for advanced defense platforms like the F-35 fighter jets, Tomahawk missiles, and also critical for civilian infrastructure like electric vehicles and high-end semiconductors. So trade policy here isn't just about economics, it's really about strategic choke points.
What's fascinating here, though, is the financial irony. This policy that causes so much economic disruption and costs consumers trillions, it's also generating record income for the U.S. government.
It is. It's the flip side of the coin. The U.S. Treasury reported that customs duties, these very tariffs we're talking about, totaled a record $202 billion for 2025. That represents a 142% surge from the previous year. It's huge.
142%.
Yeah. So this surge in tariff revenue is acting as a crucial, if politically controversial, revenue stream. And here's the kicker. This money helped offset the record interest payments on the national debt. Those payments totaled over $1.2 trillion and actually exceeded defense spending by $57 billion. So in effect, tariffs are funding the interest on our debt.
Okay, let's transition now from the economics of global policy to the economics of technology. The AI boom is fantastic, no doubt, in terms of innovation. But when we look at the energy consumption of these massive cloud data centers, we have to ask, is this infrastructure really sustainable long term?
That concern is driving a pretty fundamental shift in computing architecture. It really is. ARM Holdings CEO Rene Haas suggests that relying on massive numbers of multi-gigawatt cloud data centers is simply not sustainable. Can't keep doing it. His proposed solution is moving AI inference, that's the actual process of running the AI models, away from the cloud, moving it to local applications. This hybrid model means the intelligence resides in the chips right inside your phone, your computer, or your smart glasses.
And we're seeing this materialize in consumer tech right now. It means AI is becoming personal, not just something remote in the cloud.
That's exactly right. Look at the Meta Ray-Ban smart glasses. Simple voice commands like, "Hey Meta." They're processed locally on ARM chips within the glasses themselves. They aren't sent off to some distant server farm. In this edge computing shift, it's already translating into massive revenue. EssilorLuxottica, the maker of Ray-Bans, attributes over 4 percentage points of its recent quarterly revenue growth directly to that Meta Smart Glasses partnership.
4% just from that. Wow.
Yeah, they're betting big on this model, maybe even replacing phone functionality entirely down the line.
Okay, so that shift putting powerful, locally processing AI into common household and wearable devices, that brings us right to the, let's say, volatile intersection of home security, privacy, and law enforcement. What happens when this powerful home tech moves outside the living room and becomes part of a crime investigation platform?
That is precisely the motivation behind this new partnership involving Amazon Ring, Flock Safety, and Axon Enterprise. Ring is partnering to share video footage with law enforcement through a new feature called Ring Community Requests, and it uses the Flock platform. This essentially allows officers to request specific video evidence from Ring users located in a relevant area for an investigation.
Okay, but how does this new system address the really intense criticism that previous surveillance efforts faced? I remember that being a big issue.
The key difference, they argue, is consent. The old Ring Request for Assistance system, that was discontinued. This new system is strictly opt-in only by citizens. That's the crucial point.
Right, opt-in.
Furthermore, any shared footage is routed through the secure Flock platform, which aims to address those chain of custody concerns that, dogged previous decentralized sharing efforts. Flock's CEO, Garrett Langley, he argues that this actually empowers citizens by giving them specific control over what footage they share, versus, say, a police officer just showing up door to door and demanding access.
But critics are still highly skeptical of the aggregate impact of building this kind of network, even if it's opt-in.
Oh, definitely. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, they call this technology, even with opt-in consent, around-the-clock warrantless digital dragnet. Strong words. They argue that normalizing this constant expectation of surveillance fundamentally undermines privacy, which they see as essential for freedom. It's that classic tension, isn't it? Security versus civil liberties, just amplified now by powerful local AI in everyday devices.
Okay, we've talked about global friction and tech tension. Let's turn back to the domestic front for a moment, where political gridlock is causing some real economic damage. Specifically, the ongoing government shutdown, which has now dragged into its third week.
And the consequences are starting to hit the travel industry pretty hard. CEOs from both United and Delta have warned that continued political instability will likely start reducing airline bookings as public confidence erodes. And we are already seeing flight disruptions because of air traffic control staff shortages, directly resulting from the lack of government funding.
And the political paralysis itself is just shocking. We saw a bill designed only to pay the U.S. military during the shutdown fail in the Senate.
That failure really highlights the dysfunction, doesn't it? The bill failed in a 50-44 procedural vote. Why? Because the House had added politically charged amendments, these so-called poison pills, things like eliminating Ukraine assistance, rolling back vaccine requirements, limiting abortion access. It demonstrates that fundamental governance functions are effectively being held hostage by hyper-partisan riders attached to must-pass legislation. And just as another indicator of the general instability, we also saw former National Security Advisor John Bolton indicted by a federal grand jury this week. That just adds to the theme of political paralysis and turmoil.
Okay, let's try to pivot from that political chaos to something more focused on personal financial stability. We want to wrap up with some practical insights. Home buying and the looming challenge of wealth transfer. If mortgage rates are dropping slightly, what can a buyer actually afford right now?
Right, there is a slight easing in the housing market, which is critical for affordability, of course. Builder confidence did rise slightly in October. The HMI hit 37, mainly because the 30-year mortgage rate dropped a bit, from around 6.5% down to 6.3%. However, builders are still struggling. They're cutting prices by an average of 6% just to move inventory. They need to sell houses.
6% average cut, okay.
Now, for the clear benchmark you asked about, if you earn a $90,000 salary, assuming you have 20% down and get a 6.5% rate, you can comfortably afford a home up to about $356,000. That's based on the standard rule that housing costs shouldn't exceed 30% of your gross income. So $356K is the ballpark.
That $356,000 number is really helpful. It helps ground the conversation for prospective buyers. Okay, finally, for those managing multi-generational wealth or expecting to, what's the biggest challenge facing the financial advisory industry today?
It's definitely the inheritance challenge. Advisors are, frankly, failing to connect with the next generation. It's a huge blind spot. A Cerulli study found that only 27% of affluent investors expecting an inheritance plan to keep the advisor who managed those riches.
Only 27%? That's low.
It is, and that number drops even lower down to just 20% for those who have already inherited. Why the switch? Well, half of those who changed simply state they already have their own advisor they trust. Another 28% say they just didn't have a relationship with their parents' advisor. This failure to proactively build strong multi-generational relationships, that's the greatest structural threat to wealth management firms today. They are essentially managing money for people they are very likely going to lose as clients.
Wow. Okay, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. We've covered quite a bit: the acute financial tension from banking volatility and that sticky consumer debt, the massive hidden cost of geopolitical trade policies, the necessary infrastructure shift in AI towards the edge, and the critical importance of trying to build personal financial security amidst all this domestic political chaos. And this raises, I think, an important question for you, the investor, the learner, listening to this. When political decisions, like imposing tariffs or triggering government shutdowns, directly create both massive government revenue and huge economic burdens on companies, how should you reevaluate the risk profile of firms that are exposed to those unpredictable government interventions? You almost have to assign a quantifiable risk to political volatility itself.
That's an excellent synthesis, and let's connect that political uncertainty right back to the rapidly advancing technology we discussed. We talked about citizens choosing, opting in to share their Ring video footage with police. The next time you upgrade your device, whether it's a phone, a watch, maybe smart glasses, you will be buying a device powerful enough to run sophisticated AI locally, right there in your hand or on your face. So, are you ready for a world where your most personal devices are not only always listening and collecting data, but are always deciding, based on your consent, how much personal data to share with the surrounding world, whether that's law enforcement or corporations? It's definitely something worth pondering as you shop for your next piece of tech.